This is Business Weekend with Ross Greenwood.
Hi and welcome to Business Weekend. Thanks for your company. I'm Ross Greenwood. Coming up on the program today, the world is now coming to grips with the prospect of higher inflation and much higher interest rates to stop it. And as Australia's unemployment rate falls to a 48-year low, enormous emphasis is now on the government's forthcoming job summit. We spoke with Treasurer Jim Chalmers just before he left for the G20 Finance Ministers Summit.
I think we've just had a wasted decade of missed opportunities because things have been too divisive.
We speak exclusively with the incoming Chief Executive of Telstra, Vicki Brady, about her ambition to grow the company more quickly.
T25 is absolutely focused on how we grow our business.
Plus, we see Amazon's biggest new robotic warehouse in Australia and speak with its local boss about the future of shopping.
But I think even more important is just the consistent everyday selection, great pricing, fast delivery.
And the Aussie company whose technology is bringing down Russian drones in Ukraine. So all of that and plenty more coming up here on today's program. But look, we really should start the show with the big pieces of news that will shape the economic conversation in the weeks and months ahead. There's the US inflation rate, 9.1%, the highest in 40 years. Now, the problem seems to be that inflation's becoming sticky and that central banks have little choice but to raise interest rates even higher, even if it hurts their economies. Here's the acting employment minister, though, Mark Butler, talking this week about the good news, bad news dilemma of having such a low unemployment rate here in Australia.
Improvingly, the participation rate, the number of Australians who are actively in work, looking for work, is at record highs, including, again, female participation rates. And the youth unemployment rate is at its lowest level, down almost 1 full percentage point, at the lowest level since before the global financial crisis. This is all terrific news for tens and tens of thousands of Australians who today find themselves in work who weren't just last month. But it also reinforces the incredible tightness of Australia's labour market and the need for government to work collaboratively with business and with unions to boost productivity, to boost skills and training, and to boost wages and job security so that workers also see a dividend from this very, very strong labour market.
Well, late this week, all the talk has been about rates rising even faster than previously expected. New Zealand this week raised its cash rate 0.5% to 2.5%. South Korea by an unprecedented 0.5% to 2.25%. And the Bank of Canada raised its rate a full 1% to 2.5%. And there's a push for the United States rates to rise 0.75% or even 1 full percent at its next meeting. Here, the cash rate is 1.35%. But this week's 48-year low unemployment rate of 3.5%, while good news that people have jobs, is a warning sign of potential rising wages inflation and therefore higher interest rates. So let's bring in here Phil O'Donoghue, Chief Economist with Deutsche Bank in Australia. Phil, always good to chat to you about this. That's the dilemma. The warning signs are there, flashing amber at the Reserve Bank, at the government, at the economy. Somebody's got to do something about it.
Yeah, look, that's exactly right, Ross. I think looking at that international evidence that you just went through, it's pretty clear where interest rates need to go here in Australia. My sense is the RBA should be moving more quickly, more abruptly, get cash rate closer to neutral, potentially in contractionary territory. OK, so therefore the next meeting, which is going to be the August meeting, it's just a little over 2 weeks' time. What should the Reserve Bank be doing? That's right, Ross. In 2 weeks in August, look, I think we should be getting a 75 basis point increase in our cash rate. We're going to get a Q2 CPI number just before that meeting. Early estimates are that's going to be a very, very strong print. I think a 75 basis point increase will give the RBA an opportunity to express an intolerance for such strong inflation, send a message to price and wage setters that, you know, we need to get inflation lower than where it is, and aggressive rate hikes are the best way to do it. OK, so the Reserve Bank, and we've certainly criticised the Reserve Bank for this, seems to have been behind the curve through this whole cycle. Now, it's been waiting for empirical evidence, the hard evidence that things are happening in our economy. And if you look at it right now, there is no outbreak of wages inflation. It actually is in a pretty sweet spot, notwithstanding the fall in the unemployment rate to 3.5%.
So why has the Reserve Bank necessarily got itself into this bind?
One of the troubles I think that the Reserve Bank of Australia has is that we're relying on quarterly data. You know, the last time we had updates on prices and wages in Australia was for Q1. Those data came in late April, in mid-May, for a point in time that was centred on Valentine's Day.
Yes.
Pre-Ukraine, pre the electricity and gas shocks we've seen here in Australia and the food price shock. So the RBA you're entirely right. The RBA needs to wait and see that data confirmation, but we can look around the world, we can see where it's going. Pretty clear that we're going to be looking at some very strong outcomes for prices and, I think, wages in the second half of this year.
OK, so the hard evidence that we got this week was the unemployment rate at 3.5%. That was a bit of something that you could actually hang your hat on and say, well, there it is. There is obviously this 500,000 job vacancies out there. There's around about the same number of people who are unemployed in Australia right now. Pre the pandemic, there were 3 times as many people unemployed for the job vacancies that were out there. That shows how that labour market has tightened.
That's exactly right. The last time the unemployment rate was lower than it is now was 1974.
Yeah.
This is an incredibly strong labour market. Every textbook you look at tells you that one thing is going to happen is that wages are going to increase. That really reinforces the price and wage dynamics that the RBA is going to be facing. And, they're going to need to get interest rates higher more quickly to deal with that.
And it is also staggering because you look back during the early stages of the pandemic, people really thought the unemployment rate was going to double digits. It peaked out around 7.5%, and to see it have fallen down to 3.5%, that as much as anything else is about locked borders, about the fact we didn't get migrants coming into this country, and as a result, the demand as our economy really heated up was for labour, and business can't find the labour right now.
Yeah, look, that's exactly right. To be fair, we have seen an excellent response from effectively adults. We've seen here in Australia those local adults that can work coming into the labour market. We've got a labour force participation rate higher than we've ever seen in Australia. So we've had a good supply response domestically, but you're entirely right. We're still losing, we're still missing that migration, particularly in lower skilled jobs, which has been such a crucial part of the economy pre-COVID.
OK, so then go further forward, because if we go and have a look at some of this labour force data, you talk about that participation rate there, record numbers of women in our workforce. And I mean, that's one of the big keys of the government with its Jobs Summit, is all about childcare. It's all about getting more women into the workforce, but it's also about skills. But it's actually a problem if there's a big demand for labour, but you simply don't have enough people in the country. That's where the migration debate comes into it.
Yeah, look, that's right. And you're certainly hearing the business community calling out for an increase in migration to fill some of those skills gaps. Like everything, there is a balance. There is a balance between training local workers or potential workers, and also getting the right balance in terms of importing those skills where we're getting mismatches here locally. So a bit of both, but yeah, certainly more migration will ease some of these wage pressures.
So I was just having a look this week at the futures about where the money markets believe the cash rate will peak, that 3-month interbank rate. Now, it says basically the cash rate could peak out around 3.5%, which, where it is at 1.35%, means we're not even halfway through the rate rising cycle yet, if they're right. Most economists have got the cash rate peaking around 2.5%. What's your own view on that?
Yeah, I'm a little bit in between those two numbers, Ross. I think we're going to go up to about 3%, potentially a little bit above 3%. That's going to take policy into outright contractionary territory. I think that's going to be enough. It does mean we're going to see a much weaker economy, I think, next year than we're seeing this year. But a little bit over 3% is where I'm calling the terminal rate here. And
was it important because we saw New Zealand in raising rates this week to that 2.5%? It actually deliberately said we have now got contractionary monetary policy. We are deliberately trying to cool down our economy, cool down spending. You sense that's where ultimately the Reserve Bank will have to go if it is to kill off this inflation.
Yeah, pretty much. That's exactly right, Ross. And indeed, looking at the New Zealanders, they started their hiking cycle 10 months ago. It is the most mature and the deepest hiking cycle we've seen of any G10 country. So it will be very interesting to watch how the New Zealand economy goes. I think we can draw lessons, certainly for Australia, but also potentially for other countries in terms of how high rates are going to need to go.
It's really interesting this week. We've been observing that the price of oil, which is down 33% from its peak, the price of timber, the price of copper, are all well down from their peaks this year. those things are deflationary,
Yes.
taking pressure off prices. But I get the sense that central banks around the world right now are genuinely worried about the fact that wages inflation, for example, we're talking about that, that gets into an economy and it's much harder to get out. And that's the reason why the central banks are prepared to keep rising, even though there's evidence of cooling prices in some areas.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Look, you look around that kind of supply side story, those supply side inflationary pressures, and key commodity prices have all come off. The only exception is gas. Everything else has come off the recent peak. So that's really encouraging. The problem is that supply side inflation story has now manifested into a demand side story. And as you say, much more difficult to get out of the system once it's in there.
Phil O'Donoghue from Deutsche Bank, many thanks for your time today.
That's right.
Which all makes, of course, the government and the Treasurer and the timing of the government's Jobs Summit announced this week so important. It's scheduled for September 1 and 2. The urgency of the summit can't be underplayed as the Reserve Bank and government, as you can hear, seek rapid solutions to this rising inflation. But as many economists, including Phil O'Donoghue just now, has told us, if wages inflation gets out of control, then rates will have to stay higher for longer and potentially hurt the economy. But how do you balance that up against workers who want their pay to keep up with the rising cost of living? I spoke to the man in the middle of this delicate balancing act, the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, before he left for the G20 Finance Ministers Summit this week.
Yeah, thanks for having me back on your show, Ross. I think there are a couple of things about that. First of all, when it comes to inflation expectations, I think there's the universal expectation that inflation will get a bit worse before it gets a bit better. But everybody understands that it will get better. And most of the economists, including at least one that you've just referenced in your introduction, expect inflation to moderate next year in 2023. And I think that is important to understand. We've got this spike in inflation right now, which has a number of sources, both global and domestic. And our expectation and our hope is that those pressures will moderate. And as you know, I'll be updating the Parliament later this month in quite a detailed way on the expectations that the government has and the Treasury have for inflation, but also growth and wages and all the rest of it. But you're absolutely spot on to say how important the Jobs Summit is to all of these various balances that we are trying to strike as we manage the near-term pressures in our economy and chart the course to a better future at the same time. And what we hope that the Jobs Summit, the Jobs and Skills Summit, will do is bring people together around these big economic challenges. We're not so naive to think that there will be unanimity around some of these issues, including some of the issues around wages. But we do hope and expect, and we do want to see some sort of consensus emerging around skills shortages and labour shortages and strong and sustainable wages growth and training and migration and all of these really important areas.
So they're the different streams that you will have that different ministers will be responsible for. One of the key ones here clearly is immigration, because right now you've got business groups calling for a significant increase in migration rates to take pressure off the shortage of skills in Australia. Then there's a second part about this. When you looked at the immigration data this week from the Bureau of Statistics, it's still back only at around the third of the level that it was pre the pandemic. So there is room to move more people into this country to potentially take pressure off the labour market and therefore off wage rises as well.
Yeah, we do recognise, Ross, that migration needs to be part of the story, but it can't ever be the whole story. You know, we can't see migration as a substitute for what we need to do in terms of training Australians for opportunities, what we need to do when it comes to participation. So primarily by making childcare cheaper, you get more participation, particularly of newer parents, into an economy that desperately needs their skills and abilities. So migration will be part of the conversation at the Jobs Summit. It is already part of the conversation that so many of us are having with stakeholders in business and unions and elsewhere. It will be an important part of the story, but not the whole thing. And I think that there is, if you want to reflect on the way this conversation unfolds, and Ross, you've been a veteran of this conversation, as have I, you know, I think too often people assume that we have to choose between one lever or another when it comes to these pressures in our labour markets and our supply chains and what's happening to wages. and all of that, when in reality we need to work out the best combination of these measures. And one of the benefits of bringing everyone together in one room to nut out and address some of these challenges is that we can consider them all together rather than in these kinds of unnecessary silos that sometimes it degenerates into. And so I think that's another important part of our objectives for the summit.
And do you get a sense out of this summit that it leads to some sort of reform, either in industrial relations or in tax? Because these have been some of the most fraught political areas for any government to challenge in the past.
Oh, they sure have, Ross, and there's no hiding from that or pretending otherwise. But again, I mean, I don't expect all 100 or so of the participants in the Jobs Summit to agree on every issue. And perhaps some of those that you've just listed will be difficult as well. It would be naive to think that everybody's going to come there and in the first 5 minutes agree on a way forward. But I think that there is some prospect of a general consensus and perhaps some specific policy ideas that come out of the summit so that we can begin to make progress on some of these big economic challenges. I genuinely think that there's an appetite in business and unions and other key stakeholder groups, but also in the broader Australian community, an appetite to come together and see what we might be able to achieve together. I think there has been too much division and too much assumed division in the way we think about some of these big economic challenges. I think we've just had a wasted decade of missed opportunities because things have been too divisive and nobody's kind of genuinely tried to bring people together to see where the common ground is and the common interest is. And so that's how I see the summit. I think it's a great opportunity. It'll be here before long, the first week of September. And there'll be lots going on in the lead up to that as well. And so I think it's a big chance for Australia. Everybody now understands the economic challenges that we've got. I think most people are relatively optimistic, as I am, about the future of this country and the future of its economy. But our ability to fully capitalise on the opportunities which will present themselves in the next year and the coming years after that will depend on our ability to find that common ground like we intend to do at the summit.
Speaking of common ground, I mean, the Hawke and Keating government famously found common ground with the ACCC with the wages accord. Now, we're talking, early 1990s. Is there the pressure now to have a similar wages accord as there was then? There is, after all, no indexation.
Well, again, I think there's a specific part of that and a broader part of that. On the specific side around wages, I know that people have expressed a view about wages, but if you made a long list of all of the things which are contributing to this inflation problem we've got in the economy, wages growth wouldn't be on that list right now. These wages are not the reason why we've got this inflation, and so I don't share a number of the concerns which have been raised about some kind of destructive wage spiral or whatever you would like to call it. We've still got real wages falling quite substantially. We want to see those wages growing in a sustainable way, and that means by making the economy more productive so that there are lots of win-wins for employers and employees and we get living standards up. So I don't share some of those kind of quite dire warnings about all of that, but we need to be vigilant. The best way to be vigilant about wages is to make sure we're growing the economy the right way, that incomes growth is sustainable based on productivity growth in a way that everybody can benefit. And if you think about that period that you're referencing from history, from 1983, and I speak to Paul Keating and Bill Kelty about this, and I speak to them about the Accord, and that did kick off, I think, a period of quite remarkable reform because people were prepared in the early 80s to put their heads together to see what they could achieve together, and that's the spirit that we're trying to recapture. On the Accord very specifically, whatever you call the relationship between government, business and unions, we do want to revitalise that relationship. I think that there are really important ways we could do that in climate change, in wages growth, in labour shortages. Really, there's so many areas where the government, business and unions could put their heads together and achieve something remarkable for the country. So we do want to recapture that spirit, but the issues that will be central to that relationship will inevitably be different in 2022 and 2023 than they were in 1983.
Good to have you in the program, and many thanks for your time today.
Appreciate it, Ross. All the best.
Coming up after the break, we catch up with Telstra's incoming Chief Executive, Vicki Brady, for an exclusive chat after her appointment. After being the architect of massive cost cuts, she lays out plans for a faster growing future for Australia's biggest telecommunications company. Thanks for being with us here on Business Weekend. Now, if there's one regulator constantly in our lives, it's the competition and consumer watchdog, the ACCC. And right now, with pressure on so many prices, its role is important to make sure there's sufficient competition in every industry to make pricing as keen as it possibly can be. Late this week, I was asked to do a Q&A with ACCC Chair Gina Cass-Gottlieb for Business Sydney. I asked her about the role of the Commission. Here in Australia, given the fact we've got a fight against inflation right now, when prices start to rise, if there is insufficient competition, that is going to lead to fairly easy price rises. The question is whether you think that there is enough competition in Australia to prevent the inflation that will therefore potentially damage Australia's economy by virtue of the higher interest rates that may come.
So that's a very question and aspect that the ACCC is looking at closely. So the concern is about cosy duopoly and the coordination that can occur in concentrated markets. There are elements about Australian markets where you see some differences to that, but they also put real challenge for the ACCC to be very careful. So you see small entrants and recent entrants that make a big difference. And the protection of their capacity to continue to make that difference. They may enter and they may leave, but while they are present, they create real change and real competitive context. So this week, yesterday, in the decision that the ACCC gave to allow the acquisition by Horizon of OneRail, it allowed in relation to where they largely did not overlap, which was in the Northern Territory in South Australia, the capacity for the business to take forward a rationale for greater investment in transport in those states and the development of more shifting and, frankly, logistical movement in competition with road from Darwin down throughout those areas. But the critical problem was the reduction from 3 to 2, removing a new entrant as against Horizon and Pacific National, particularly in relation to coal haulage on the east coast of Australia. Ultimately, that has been resolved by accepting what we felt was an acceptable divestiture remedy, which maintains the status quo in relation to that. So it maintains a recent entrant, OneRail, able in fact to grow and to continue to pose existing competition in New South Wales and growing potential entry in Queensland. So it's a combination of recognising where there is potential for entry and growth and being very minded to preserve that and not to allow that to be lost.
Now, one of Australia's most complex companies, Telstra, this week announced that it's moved all of its call centres back to Australia, creating around 2,000 jobs in the process. This is against a backdrop of not just customer complaints about foreign accents, but also a cheaper Australian dollar that makes it much more viable. And also, of course, here, skilled labour shortages. From September this year, Vicki Brady will be Telstra's Chief Executive, replacing Andy Penn. Right now, she's its Chief Financial Officer, presiding over these tough financial decisions. I caught up with her early this week.
Part of T22 was really fundamentally simplifying the experience for our customers. And yes, that has resulted in flow-through, in cost savings. It's also resulted in call volumes into our contact centres dropping by around 2/3. And so inside T22, we had always planned to bring our call centres back on shore for our consumer and small business customers. And it's really pleasing to have achieved that milestone last week.
OK, so then tell me about trying to find staff for your call centres here in Australia. Is that difficult now? Because quite clearly everybody's scrabbling for workers.
Well, it is a big topic of conversation. I know skills shortages is widely spoken about. Look, we went out there, we needed to find 2,000 additional people, And what we found over the last few months as we've been recruiting, there's no doubt people are looking for flexibility, and with Telstra we absolutely provide that flexibility where roles can be done from anywhere. We also found that people are looking to join companies where there are diverse career paths. So I might start taking calls from customers, but I've got many options as my career progresses. And so, yes, there's a lot of people, a lot of companies out there recruiting at the moment, but we were able to successfully recruit the 2,000 people that we needed.
Well, you've been the Chief Financial Officer since 2019, so during this T22 period, that wrapped up a month ago, but you've already moved straight on to T25. With inflation in Australia and the pressure for higher wages, is it going to be as easy to find these savings over the next 3 years as it was over the previous 3?
Well, look, it's a good question, Ross. And the thing I would call out under T22, a major focus of that was simplification, which flowed through to significant cost savings. And as we move into T25, T25 is absolutely focused on how we grow our business. And yes, there are still productivity and cost disciplines we've got to maintain, but they are of a much smaller scale. So we're looking under T25, so to June 25, to take around $500 million of net cost out of the business compared to T22, where our target was to take around $2.7 billion in cost out.
OK, so just tell me, because you've been in marketing roles at Telstra and Optus before, you started your career at KPMG, you know telcos, you're a Chief Financial Officer, that's all about costs, that's all about the return to the shareholders. As the Chief Executive, and you say you've got to find the growth, which is more fun to run the business as? The person who's looking after the costs or the person who's trying to grow the business?
Well, I challenge you on the role of the CFO because I think it does go beyond cost, but obviously when you're in the chair, as I am right now as the CFO, undoubtedly delivering those returns, so long-term returns to shareholders is always front of mind. But I am super excited come 1 September stepping into the CEO role, and at a point in time where we've got great foundations from T22, which is now finished, and we're now into T25, which absolutely is focused on how we continue to grow our business and deliver those exceptional experiences for our customers.
OK, because one of the things I've always told people and said here on this program is that I think that Telstra is probably Australia's least recognised technology company. And really, it's not rated like tech companies are here in this country or around the world. It's not as volatile, quite clearly, because of the stability of the earnings that come through. But the reality is that the enterprises that Telstra has invested in, the investments it's made into 5G, and eventually it'll come into 6G, that really gives great opportunity for enormous growth, potentially for the business, so long as you don't get caught up in competition and price cutting.
Well, I think you've hit on a really key point. There's no doubt, as a telco, we are investing in incredible technology and infrastructure, and it absolutely underpins the digital aspirations of the country, of our customers. And, I'm really excited, and I think, we're in a great position. We've got the leading mobile network in the country. Through COVID, we've just found connectivity is more important than ever. And so that's what's exciting as we head into T25. I think there are so many opportunities for how Telstra can help enable our customers to get the most out of that technology and help them move their ambitions forward. And so I'm pretty excited about getting the opportunity to help, lead our organisation come September.
Vicki Brady, many thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Ross. Great to be with you.
Coming up after the break, 2 amazing companies using world-leading technology inside Amazon's biggest robotic warehouse here in Australia. We speak with its local head, plus the Aussie company whose products are right now grounding Russian drones in Ukraine. Thanks for being with us here on Business Weekend. Australia's contribution to Ukraine as it defends itself against the Russian invasion is increasing. The latest commitment is $100 million in military supplies, including a further 34 armoured vehicles on top of the 20 Bushmasters already sent. But another Australian product sent through different channels is also having a big impact in this modern warfare where drones are the eyes, the electronic disruptors and the weapons of the conflict.
Drones are a new technology that found all kinds of applications in warfare. Drones can be used for surveillance or persistent surveillance over long amounts of time and over a substantial amount of territory. Those things have hours of flight time. They can be used to deliver payloads, whether it's grenades or something else. They can be used to track troops. There's quite a few applications, and we find that in the Ukrainian-Russian war, all of those applications are being extensively done by both sides, so both the Russians and the Ukrainians. And drones are not certainly a replacement for traditional ways of doing war, so tanks and aircraft and troops still very much have their place. And the main mantra here is combined arms, where we're saying the main concept is for all of the things that you have working together, and drones are part of that combined arms picture.
Okay, so because they're used for surveillance, because they're used to deliver weapons, the fact is that if you can somehow have countermeasures against them, you clearly have some form of superiority. So that's kind of where companies such as yours come in.
100%. Drone Shield started about 7 years ago, well before drones were seen as a potential threat, and indeed back then a drone would maybe fly 30 meters, smack against the nearest tree, and that would be the end of it. So people thought that we were crazy, but we had conviction that as any technology, the drone technology was going to continue to rapidly improve. So the sense and avoid, the payload, the cameras, the flight times, the battery, the blades, the engine. So with it would be the rise of applications in the nefarious space. So we were very much focused in the beginning on counter-terror applications, people smuggling contraband into prisons, protecting borders against drug trafficking. But what we found over time is that drones, and small drones in particular, were used more and more in the war itself. So the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, Syrian conflict. But interestingly, drones very much stayed off the front pages in those conflicts until the Ukrainian-Russian conflict came along. And there, of course, drones were very much front and center of the war. So Drone Shield developed a suite of counter-drone capabilities, both detection and defeat. Awareness is always the first thing, so knowing that the drone is there, it might be conducting surveillance, it might be about to drop a charge. If you're sitting in a tank, you certainly don't want a drone above you, potentially dropping charges. With it comes the defeat. So detection first, then the assessment, is it a big drone, small drone, and then actually how do you take the drone down, which is a combination of our defeat technologies from body-worn to on-vehicle to fixed site stuff.
Okay, so then your Drone Shield products now, have they been deployed in Ukraine?
Yes, so we have done initial deployment of our products under a military aid contract, and we are currently in conversations for additional shipments. And what we found was that our gear was quite effective against Russian drones in the conflict.
So that being the case, you really would say that you have pretty leading technology around the world, anti-drone technology. So that gives a strategic advantage, you believe, against Russian drones in particular.
Yes, we believe that. It's interesting as we're finding that Russian drones have a number of components that our systems are able to pick up and also make it effective against Russian drones. Until the war started, we frankly had really no idea how effective our gear will be, because when we tested it, we tested against consumer and commercial drones, and there was simply no way of knowing whether it will be effective against Russian military drones. But what we're finding is that even military-grade drones on the Russian side are often used commercial off-the-shelf parts. So with it, we're finding that our gear is quite effective in both detection and defeat of those drones.
Okay, so that being the case, is this something that goes to Ukraine as part of the Australian contribution? We know Bushmasters have been sent, for example, by the Australian government, or is it something else? Is it a different program that's getting your defence weapons into Ukraine?
So far, it has not been the Australian government military aid. It has been one of the European countries' military aid contracts. However, we are hopeful that over time it will change and will be able to contribute as part of the Australian military aid program.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about your products is that they're made here in Australia. So even componentry and everything is actually manufactured here in Australia. That's kind of an unusual story because it is that high-tech, sort of manufacturing that really governments are looking for right now.
That's right. We have approximately 40 engineers here in Sydney, ranging from FPGA engineers to waveform designers to application software engineers. We make our products start to finish, right from the design stage to writing software updates at the end of once the product is released out to the end users. And what we're finding is that it gives you a degree of extra control. So we used to probably focus on smaller things and outsource a bit more, and over time we brought more and more things in-house, and like you said, done all here in Australia, quite important for sovereign defence capabilities. We have a supply chain of dozens of suppliers, all based here in Australia. We use some American parts, but we use as much as possible. We do as much as possible here in Sydney, including the manufacturing, both ourselves, and we also outsource manufacturing to a small extent to another Australian defence business. And I think in the current uncertain times, it's an unusual thing. But you know what? When say if a war breaks out and you're reliant just on yourself, you cannot really expect suppliers across the world to contribute to your supply chain.
So then take me to other applications apart from defence. There's quite clearly the whole security aspect of it as well, because there's a range of different ways in which drones right now can be used to compromise security.
Drones are very interesting technology because historically security has been focused on getting into the facilities from the ground. So you have these really highly secured facilities like prisons, critical infrastructure, even banks and so forth, and they're all secure from the ground. But when that was designed, people did not really envisage threat from air, so ability to do surveillance, deliver package. So for example, prisons is a key customer focus for us because they're able to deliver things like drugs, cigarettes, escape kits, weapons into prison facilities. And that's a problem not just in Australia but around the world. Like, for example, we're engaging with prisons in the US, in Europe, and so on. Drones flying around airports is a big threat because if a drone gets caught on the engine of an aircraft, it can potentially burn down the engine and crash the airliner. So today, as we saw with Gatwick a few years ago, when a drone comes into the perimeter of the airport, they have to stop all flights and basically find the drone, find the pilot, and without dedicated equipment it's very hard to do so. So traditional sensors like simple cameras or radars are not designed to detect or defeat drones, so you need specialized equipment like what we offer.
Oleg Vornik, many thanks for your time, appreciate it.
Thank you, Ross.
Well, from one amazing piece of technology to another, Amazon is listed by Forbes as the 6th biggest business in the world, with annual sales close to $470 billion. In Australia last year, its revenue was around $1.75 billion. But with 6 giant warehouses, its aspirations are far bigger. I went through its latest robotic warehouse in Sydney this week and caught up with its Australian country manager, Janet Menzies. So, Janet, I want you to describe Amazon for me. Is it a retailer? Is it a tech company? Is it a warehouse company?
Right.
What is it?
Good question. It's a customer company, right? So at the end of the day, what we're about is great selection, competitive prices, and delivery, a reliable, fast delivery.
Okay, but that sounds kind of like an online retailer as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that, of course, needs to be backed by great information, technology, innovation, right? The data that we can, the way that we manage our logistics is a huge part of that. If I look at we support many sellers, right? We've got 11,000 Australian sellers selling on Amazon today. And so a lot of that is about helping them digitize, allowing them to get online, and then helping them run their businesses every day. So,
and that makes them more competitive, I presume, as well, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you look at if you look at how Australian businesses have evolved in the last few years, it's incredible. So many of them have become digitized, and we're really proud of the role we can play in that. Right? Whether people are just starting and have never been online and are starting to set their own site, whether they're figuring out their own logistics capability, or if they're already super experienced, we have a role to play in that. You know, we're really able to help small businesses especially figure out, well, how can they best deliver to the customer? And sometimes that's about having inventory placed here, having us do the delivery for them, and also it's about them benefiting from the customers who come to us to look for products. And of course, the reason that's so important is that we can't deliver what we need to as Amazon unless we have a really broad selection. So we have 200 million products on the site nowadays. I mean, that's a new number that we've just passed that milestone, and we're super proud. But that wouldn't happen without sellers being on the site with us.
So one of the things in running this business around Australia, the concept of the number of boxes, the logistics of it, is it ever really a bit overwhelming to you? No.
Oh, look, it's all for the customer, right? So sometimes, I have to say the mathematics, the analytics, the data that's behind this work is actually one of the things I get most excited about, right? Because understanding, who needs what where is what we're all about.
Okay, so you were a Cochlear before you were here.
I was.
Tell me about the difference between Cochlear and this place.
Well, I think that similarities are both highly innovative companies, right? And also very customer obsessed. If you get an implant, you have that implant for your whole life.
Yes.
At Amazon, we're all about how do we get, what you need all the time. We're customer obsessed, so very similar. Differences, obviously scale is quite different. At Cochlear, a very small number of boxes,
yes,
but very important boxes. Here, huge variety of what we're selling.
There's one other aspect of this that really gets me, and that is the aspect of work. Right now, interesting enough, in the past, many of these people might have been picking and packing. So for a place that has a lot of robotics, it still has a lot of employment. And that's different employment than what people might have had 5 or 10 years ago.
Absolutely. I mean, people are still the heart of the operation. If you look at each parcel, it touches, I believe the number is at least 4 people. So it's still very much a people business. It's just about, it used to be that people would walk quite long distances to go pick items. Now those items come to them.
So take me to actually Jeff Bezos. When he set up Amazon, yes, he's famous for not paying dividends. He's famous for investing the money back into the business. That's what this is all about, isn't it? Trying to build Amazon to a scale, to give it market share in Australia, to really reinvest in this business long term.
Exactly right. I think one of the things that really sets Amazon apart is our leadership principles. Very early on, there was a real focus on being customer-centric and, as you mentioned, focusing on the long term. So one of the things is we come to a place like Australia and we want to get to know the customers, right? And everywhere we go, we talk to our team members about that customer centricity and that long-term vision. And that means that we need to constantly be innovating. And these sound like words, but I got to tell you, being at Amazon for this is my second Prime Day. I've seen it in action. The way that we're really prepared to think about what is best for the customer, to make decisions that are not the right thing in the short term, but are the right thing for the customer in the long term. I've really seen an incredible culture that really focuses on those long-term principles.
But in many ways, it says everything about change, the change of work, the change of shopping, the change of warehousing, just the change of data as well. These are all things that were wrapped up in the beginning of Amazon, which we see here in Australia today. But it's also, as I say, continuing to move. It's not something that stops.
No, that's it. And we have principles. We have these leadership principles. There's 16 of them. I'd encourage anyone who's interested to read them. We have these 2 things. We have long-term thinking, so we don't sacrifice the customer. We focus on the long term. We also have this bias for action. So we're not afraid to try stuff, and we're not afraid to make mistakes. We might, there'll be deals that we run today for Prime Day that we think are really exciting, and customers are going to say, actually, that's not what I was looking for, right? Alternatively, there'll be things that we go out of stock on where we're going to think, oh, we wish we bought more. There'll be experiments that we've run today that we'll learn a ton from, and we're not afraid to take those steps forward when at the same time we keep the long term ahead. So, we're a failure-oriented company in a way.
So in some ways, though, it's also the ability not just for the shopper, the consumer at the end of Amazon's, chain, but it's also at the beginning. It's actually the small businesses that provide many of the goods that are in these warehouses. That's that relationship, so that therefore there's a democratisation that any small business can effectively become a relatively big business by using the fulfilment that Amazon will offer them.
That's right. I think that, I think one of the things that Amazon did really well early on is to realize that if we wanted to offer the greatest selection, so again, if we're about selection, value, and fast delivery, delivery, in order to have the best possible selection, we needed to have sellers on our site. They're able to innovate, to constantly bring new products to market. And so, more than 50% of products around the world at Amazon are actually delivered by or are sold by sellers, as opposed to being products that Amazon itself buys and sells. And I think that's one of our strengths. We have this we are able to bring that selection. Now, what that means is we have to have great value for sellers. It needs to mean that whether or not you're a new business looking to get digitized for the first time, or if you're a company that's quite sophisticated or a seller that's already online, have its website, we need to have great services that make your life easy. And that's why products like Fulfillment by Amazon, where a seller would list on our site, bring our inventory here, we'll store it for them in these facilities. They'll be stowed away, and then we'll deliver it for them. That's why those programs like that are so important, both because they help a seller, but ultimately they help us offer this incredibly broad selection for customers.
But what that means is that now there is no barrier to being able to become a business person.
That's right.
You can be a business person in the middle of Australia. You can be a business person in a city. You can be young. You can be old. So long as you've got a product and you can find a market and sell it, that's the change, I guess, that's taking place in our community.
No, that's exactly right. It used to be that we had this, there were so many limitations, right? You needed to deliver products to a specific brick and mortar. You needed to be able to deliver all across Australia. If you're a seller and you want to get on Amazon, you just need to be able to deliver to one of our fulfillment centers, and we take care of the rest. And I agree, it's a democratization. It means it's a much more inclusive seller community than we ever could have imagined. I look at some of Doggy Bomb Co. is a Melbourne, regional Victoria-based company that sells pet products. I don't know that would have existed 10, 20 years ago. It certainly would have been slower to ramp. You look at organizations who use us for export. They list on the Australian site, but then it's a gateway to the US, the UK, other big markets. And so I think that's one of the things that I get excited about as the country manager, is the ability to help Australian business not only sell to customers here in Australia, but also become bigger businesses by accessing consumer groups that are much larger than ours, let's face it, in these other geographies.
Janet, many thanks for your time today. Thanks for the look around as well.
Thank you.
So that's it for the program this Sunday. Up next is all the latest news right here on Sky News. Business Weekend returns next Sunday, but don't forget you can keep up to date with all the latest business news with our daily program Business Now, 4:30 and 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Plus our program, of course, is available via our website skynews.com.au. Thanks for your company today. I'm Ross Greenwood. We'll see you next week.